I always say I ran the first time and I won. Then I ran a second time and I did much better. We got millions and millions more votes. And you know what? That's going to be a story for a long time. What a disgrace it was. But we may just have to do it again. We have to straighten out our things.
Donald Trump returned to Washington last week for the first time since he left office, as the Justice Department's criminal investigation into the attack on the U.S. Capitol now looks at his actions and the extent of his involvement in trying to overturn the 2020 election results.
The committee will be in order.
Hello and welcome to Inside America. I'm Ghida Fakhry. While he has so far survived several ongoing investigations and 2 impeachments, could a federal indictment be looming for former President Donald Trump? No former U.S. president has ever faced criminal charges in the country's history. In recent weeks, the Congressional Committee investigating the attempted insurrection that took place on January 6, 2021, to block the certification of Joe Biden's election victory, has heard damning testimony from former White House and government officials. The committee, which will resume its hearings in September, heard from several Republican witnesses who criticized the former president's actions and described his unwillingness to stop the riot at the U.S. Capitol as, quote, pouring gasoline on the fire.
President Trump did not try to calm his thousands of disappointed supporters. Instead, at almost the same moment violence was getting completely out of hand, Donald Trump sent his 224 tweet. The president said, Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution, despite knowing the Capitol had been breached and the mob was in the building.
This assessment was reinforced by testimony from former White House officials.
So it was obvious that the situation at the Capitol was violent and escalating quickly. And so I thought that the tweet about the vice president was the last thing that was needed in that moment. And I remember thinking that this was going to be bad for him to tweet this because it was essentially him giving the green light to these people, telling them that what they were doing at the steps of the Capitol and entering the Capitol was okay, that they were justified in their anger. And he shouldn't have been doing that.
Now, this follows recent revelations that text messages during a key period leading up to the January 6th attack on the Capitol from 2 top officials at the Department of Homeland Security were deleted in what was described as an agency-wide reset of government phones. Thousands of text messages from Secret Service agents and other employees were also reportedly deleted. Now, while the January 6th criminal investigation continues, Trump's allies have reportedly started preparing for a potential second term, while his lawyers quietly mount a legal defense against possible criminal charges from the Department of Justice. Joining me now is long-term Trump advisor Sam Nunberg. Sam Nunberg, the scope of the criminal investigation into the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol has now widened to include people within Trump's inner immediate circle and possibly the former president himself. You worked with Donald Trump as an advisor for 5 years. In fact, you were one of the first hires on the 2016 campaign trail. But you later had a fallout saying, quote, there's nobody who hates him more than me. Putting aside any personal animus, do you believe Trump should face criminal charges for his role in inciting an insurrection at the U.S. Capitol?
Absolutely not. I don't believe that President Trump, one, committed any crime. It seems to me that the Justice Department, as of now, is looking for a crime and that they've been heavily influenced by the January 6th committee hearings, which incidentally always seem to conveniently leave out that President Trump, in his speech that day on January 6th, told the crowd to walk to the Capitol peacefully.
Well, hold on. You say he hasn't committed any crime, but at the very least, hasn't the Congressional Committee's investigation shown that he has sought to obstruct, if not obstructed, a government proceeding, which is the certification of the 2020 election?
Well, he did not directly obstruct it. And that's an interesting point there, because they can point to no law whereby that he actually violated or ordered or had his attorneys violate it. What they did try to do was to have the states investigate what they thought was fraud. Now, they could not prove that, Ghida, and I'm not saying that they did prove that. In fact, I think that he actually lost the election. But what they haven't shown is where the actual crime is, where a violation of a statute of a statute is. You know, we've had Congress and congressmen before, including congressmen sitting on the January 6th committee, protest on the floor electors being certified. And at the end of the day, he wasn't successful in doing it. As we all know, on January 6th,
but it doesn't mean he didn't try. I mean, as you know, there's over 800 people who've already faced charges ranging from seditious conspiracy to obstruct a government proceeding. If the evidence shows that there was intent to overturn the election results and obstruct the certification process, as it is increasingly looking based on the evidence the committee has shown, and if no one is above the law, why shouldn't Trump or any other former president of the United States who may have broken the law be indicted?
Well, that's a hypothetical. Now, I do not believe any president is above the law. I do believe a president, especially post-presidency where they're not sitting in office, can very well be indicted. But once again, let's go to whether or not he actually committed a crime here. Now, the grand jury certainly has expanded who they are interviewing, who they are questioning, and I've been in grand juries, so I would know from Trump investigations, they are certainly looking and investigating Donald Trump and his acts. We've also seen that the Justice Department and the FBI have taken the cell phones and have raided President Trump's then lawyers that were representing him. You also have Rudy Giuliani, who's also been disbarred. Now, the facts surrounding this don't look good. We know that President Trump's legal team is preparing for a possible indictment.
But there are a lot of murky facts, as you say. There are a lot of murky facts still surrounding this. There's also what some are suggesting could be a cover-up, given the thousands of text messages and communications of Secret Service agents and top officials from the Department of Homeland Security, text messages that simply have vanished and are nowhere to be found during that crucial period of January 5th and 6th. But it isn't for you and me to decide whether or not the former president should be indicted. My question, though, is why shouldn't justice take its course and allow the evidence to lead where it will?
It would also say that we also don't know that President Trump ordered those texts or any of that evidence or any of those records to be destroyed.
No, and that is not my suggestion. But I'm saying there are a lot of facts that we still don't know. But the question is, the U.S. Attorney General promised to, quote, hold accountable anyone who is criminally responsible for attempting to interfere with the legitimate lawful transfer of power, as he said. Shouldn't justice be allowed to take its course and for the charges to lead to where the evidence does?
Well, first of all, let's talk about Merrick Garland. As we all know, Merrick Garland was nominated for the Supreme Court by Barack Obama. His nomination was held up by then Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. And oh, by the way, then candidate President Trump campaigned on the trail and said that his nomination should be held up. I, in fact, think that he should actually be recusing himself and that he has that this is something where it may be personal to him. That's a separate issue. The other fact is we continue to talk about the transfer of power. Power was transferred. We continue to say President Trump stopped the transfer of power. He did not. What he did was he tried to take every legal avenue, and he failed. He did a bad job at it, by the way. His team was terrible. He had terrible people around him, but that's not.
But if he failed again, that doesn't mean there wasn't criminal intent. Now let's look at the political ramifications of this.
Criminal intent.
Well, I'm not saying there is, but I'm saying that Merrick Garland is suggesting that he will pursue every avenue. I mean, other U.S. allies, democracies like France, have held former presidents accountable for what they may have done while they were in office, once they stepped down. Shouldn't the same concept apply to the United States?
Well, you're asking me if President Trump should be investigated. That's fine. Let him be investigated.
No, I'm asking if he should be charged, and if any former president should be charged, if the evidence point to the fact that they may have broken the law.
That they may have broken the law, no. If the facts point to the fact that they believe that Donald Trump violated a statute that they can point to within the federal guidelines, that they believe that they have a high probability of getting a conviction, and then that they believe it's good public policy ultimately to indict a former president of the United States, then they can go forward with an indictment.
Well, let me ask you this then. If he did ask his supporters to storm or to at least gather in front of the US Capitol, possibly storm the building in order to stop the certification process, would he have broken the law?
Would he have broken the law if he told them to storm the building, if he told them to rampage Congress, if he told them to go into the halls of Congress, if he
told them to stop the certification process, which he did do in his tweet to his vice president at the time? He suggested that that's what he should have done.
If he directly had told them that we are going to walk to the Capitol, well, we're not going to go walk to the Capitol, if he said that we're going to go storm the Capitol, that we're going, I want you all to break through, I want you all to harm the police officers, then sure, he would have committed a crime. But those aren't the facts, public facts that I've seen. And Ghida, I think it's also—
But the facts, hold on. No, the facts are that he told them to march right down onto the Capitol building, that he would be right there behind them.
But everybody seems to leave out.
And he also refused to disavow anyone who did storm the building on the next day. We know from some of the videos that were shown during the congressional hearings that he took out any sentence that remotely spoke about holding any of the rioters accountable. That is a fact. He did nothing to stop what was going on.
But once again, that's not. But once again, that in fact is not a crime. And at that point, he was advised that he could be under criminal investigation. So I think that was actually the right thing to do. That he didn't put that in. And remember, that was a speech that he didn't write. That was a speech that was prepared for him. I've prepared speeches for him. He is allowed to then edit it. And,
sure, and the point is, he edited out anything that suggested holding any of the perpetrators of the attack accountable. But let me talk to you. Let me ask you, Sam Nunberg, if I can, as someone who worked with him for so long, as someone who worked with him for 5 years, do you think that Trump, looking ahead to 2024, could use this, the investigation, a possible indictment, to his advantage? He's already told supporters at a rally recently in Texas that if he is prosecuted, we're going to have in this country the biggest protest we've ever had.
You know, I don't think it will be an advantage for him this time. I think that I think that the headwinds are against him. You know, he's running for a third time. It's going to be that he always started at a large amount of support within the GOP after he left. That support naturally, whether it was Donald Trump or anybody else, would start to decline. And there's a rising star here where I said in the state of Florida in Ron DeSantis. These are wins that he can't control. And then at the end of the day, I think that people already in our party, a lot of them, public polling and private polling has shown this, want a different candidate, want a fresh face. Further, he would be term limited out. He would only be able to serve one term. So people are going to have to be able to look at that. I've been to Iowa and I've been to New Hampshire recently, and I would say that it's not going to be easy for him to get the nomination. I believe that he knows that. I've talked to his advisors. It's going to be a difficult proposition, and in fact, an indictment here would hurt him.
Sam Nunberg, long-term Trump advisor, thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you.
Now, some people may choose to focus on the past, but elections are about the future. And I believe conservatives must focus on the future to win back America. We can't afford to take our eyes off the road in front of us, because what's at stake is the very survival of our way of life.
Former Vice President Mike Pence, who was speaking at the same conference as Trump in Washington last week, is rumored to be considering a possible run against his former boss in the next presidential election. While the Department of Justice has so far treaded very slowly and carefully in its January 6th investigation, it has recently increased the pace of its subpoenas, search warrants, and interviews of former officials. The investigation has so far led to criminal charges against more than 800 people. Facing increasing pressure to indict the former president, Attorney General Merrick Garland said the Justice Department pursues justice, quote, without fear or favor, and, quote, that we intend to hold anyone who was criminally responsible for the events surrounding January 6th for any attempt to interfere with the lawful transfer of power from one administration to another accountable. That's what we do. We don't pay any attention to other issues with respect to that. So could Trump become the first former president in U.S. history to be charged with a crime? Joining me now is William Banks, chair of the American Bar Association's Standing Committee on Law and National Security. He's also Board of Advisors Distinguished Professor of Law at Syracuse University in New York. Professor Banks, there's obviously now more intense scrutiny of Trump and more pressure on the Justice Department to file criminal charges against him. But will the Attorney General take this unprecedented step of charging a former president?
We can't say for sure at this time. It's looking more like that may happen than it was earlier in the summer. Certainly, some aspects of the testimony that has been presented to the 9 members of the January 6th committee have changed the dynamic, focusing more directly on the activities of President Trump and his state of mind. One of the challenges in building a criminal case against any of these senior officials, including the former president, is that the law here in the United States requires that there be proof of criminal intent. That is, not only that you did the act that is in violation of the law, but that you intended in doing so to violate the law.
And so far, how strong is that case against him? How strong is the evidence that has been laid out by the Congressional Committee? Because I just spoke to a former Trump advisor who said that Trump, in his view, hasn't violated any criminal statute. Is that the case?
If we credit the testimony of the staff who were in the White House on the 6th of January about the president's statements and his actions on that day, that he fully intended to try to interfere with the certification of the election and the role of Vice President Pence, and that he not only knew he wanted to do that, but that he knew in doing so he would be acting in violation of the law. I think there's a fair amount of testimony to that effect now. That, of course, hasn't been subject to cross-examination or statements of other witnesses corroborating or contradictory witnesses. But it's certainly more likely than it was earlier in the summer that the government could build a case against former President Trump. It'll be some time before we know whether that will happen. Of course, as your viewers know, the Congressional Committee itself has no authority to undertake a criminal investigation or to begin a prosecution. In the United States, those functions are very directly and formally separated between the legislative branch and the executive branch. Ironically, of course, former President Trump was the head of the executive branch, so the executive would be bringing a criminal case against its former head. For the Attorney General, for Mr. Garland, that presents a complicated picture because he's now, of course, head of the Justice Department, and he's subordinate not to Donald Trump, but to Joe Biden. There's some awkwardness there because it could be perceived that the Attorney General is in a politically compromised position because it might be seen to service the interest of President Joe Biden for a criminal prosecution be brought against a former president and possibly future presidential candidate, Donald Trump.
But before we look at the political and social ramifications of a potential indictment, has the committee, the Congressional Committee, presented enough evidence to amount to a damning indictment of Trump? I mean, as you say, there was no cross-examination of witnesses. There are also the optics of it all. I mean, did they present all the evidence prosecutors would need to indict the former president in a way that doesn't appear to be one-sided?
I think that the case for an obstruction charge, that is obstruction of a congressional proceeding, is really quite strong because it only requires that. An intention to act to interfere with Congress carrying out one of its constitutionally assigned tasks, and then taking concrete steps to see that that be done. I think former President Trump's involvement in that particular crime was pretty well established by the January 6th committee so far, admittedly, without the benefit of cross-examination and further elaboration of other witnesses. But so far, I think the case that on that particular charge, that is obstruction of a proceeding, I think the proof is there.
You mentioned the potential pitfalls, though, even if the proof is there. It is a legal process, but it is also a political process, isn't it? Especially when it involves a former president. Will the Justice Department decide that there is not just enough evidence to warrant moving forward, but enough evidence warranting an indictment, given all the potential risks it would entail, including the social and political ramifications at a time like this when the country is so deeply divided?
You've described very well the dilemmas that are going to confront Attorney General Merrick Garland in the coming weeks. The committee, of course, is on a summer recess now. There's no actual hearing scheduled. There may be more in September, but it's more likely that we've seen all or nearly all of what we're going to see of live testimony by the House committee. So the ball, as we say, really will be in Merrick Garland's court. He has to decide first about the awkwardness of his relationship in the current executive branch, that he's nominally subordinate to the President of the United States, Joe Biden, even though he takes an oath to support and defend the Constitution. And I don't know any person who has ever accused Merrick Garland of being anything other than absolutely ethical and loyal to his duties under the Constitution of the United States. Still, it's a perception, if you will, that he might be influenced by his position.
As a legal scholar, though, forgive me for interrupting you, do you believe that it is Merrick Garland's duty to indict, to charge the president with obstruction or any of the other charges?
I think Merrick Garland's duties are broader than that. I think he also has to think about the integrity of the institutions involved, that is, of the Justice Department, of the entire executive branch, the Office of the Presidency, and the Congress of the United States, not to mention the future of our constitutional republic.
And we've seen in the past when previous administrations and previous attorneys general have chosen to go in that direction, even when prosecutors found sufficient evidence to suggest that a president might have engaged in criminal conduct, whether it was Nixon or Clinton, successive administrations concluded that it might have been better to grant immunity or simply forego prosecution. The DOJ ultimately never pursued such cases. Will Garland be more concerned about avoiding the appearance of using government powers to punish political enemies than doing what some might suggest may be the right thing?
I think it's an incredibly difficult set of choices that confront Attorney General Garland. We'll have more information, I think all of us, the consumers of these materials, before the Attorney General has to make his choice. More than one choice, of course, and there are more officials than former President Trump whose future lives may be at issue here. But the major issue, of course, is Donald Trump. It's not unworthy of mention that, of course, Donald Trump is likely to be an active political candidate again. And what would the impact of an indictment be on his political future? That's not a legal criterion for Attorney General Garland, of course, but it's a very important practical one.
And could he run for office if he were indicted?
He could. He couldn't run for office if he's convicted of a felony. But if he's merely indicted, of course, our presumption in the United States is that you're innocent until proven guilty.
And just finally, yes or no, would you bet on an indictment?
I'm going to say yes.
All right. Professor William Banks, Chair of the American Bar Association Standing Committee on Law and National Security, thanks so much for being with me.
It's a pleasure.
Now, while the congressional hearings surrounding the attempted takeover of the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021 are not criminal proceedings, they've already shed light onto the events that shook American democracy, including many revealing new elements, in part through the testimony under oath of several former Trump White House staffers with first-hand knowledge of events that could form critical pieces of evidence in a criminal probe if it comes to that. With each hearing, a new potentially damning body of evidence has emerged of what may well be a larger scheme to subvert the transfer of power, rather than a single isolated event of a violent mob attacking the US Capitol. In one word, a conspiracy that may have been instigated and led by Donald Trump himself. The question now is, just a few months away from critical midterm elections and the start of the 2024 presidential campaigns, whether the Department of Justice would initiate, for the very first time in its history, the criminal prosecution of a former president. And so, in short, it would be extraordinary, but no longer far-fetched, to imagine former President Trump in the dock, a scenario that will dangerously enrage his cult-like base, all the more that both Trump and his staunch followers hope to regain the White House. But Trump is already facing the court of public opinion, Republican public opinion, with once loyal aides defecting and moving away from him. When his once favorite TV outlet Fox News turns its back on him, drawing his ire, he knows his window may be closing. But Trump being Trump, he is more likely to live by the idiom and the slogan, when the going gets tough, the tough get going, and risk even more for himself and the United States. That's all from me, Ghida, Fakhry, and the team in Washington. Thanks for watching.